Before I tell you what I found in room 9, I need to tell you that for 3 weeks I thought I was the one going insane. I manage a small apartment building. 12 units, 3 floors, the kind of place that's been standing since the 60s and carries every decade of that in its walls. Most of my tenants have been there for years. I know their routines, their noise levels, their visitors. When something is off, I notice. Room 9 had been empty for 2 months when the complaint started. The tenant in room 8, a retired teacher named Gloria, called me on a Tuesday morning to say she'd heard someone moving around next door the previous night, dragging furniture. She said it had gone on for about an hour starting around 2 in the morning. I checked room 9 the same day. The unit was exactly as I'd left it, bare walls, no furniture, the slight smell of fresh paint from the touch-up I'd done after the last tenant moved out. The windows were locked. The door had been locked with my key. I told Gloria it was probably the building settling, old pipes, thermal expansion. She said she'd lived in the building for 11 years and knew perfectly well what settling sounded like, and this was not that. I thanked her and moved on. The second call came 4 nights later. This time it wasn't Gloria. It was the tenant in room 10 on the other side, a young guy named Derek who worked nights and was home sleeping during the day. He said he'd been woken up by sounds through the wall. Not dragging this time. He said it sounded like someone breathing. Slow, deliberate, close to the wall. He said he'd knocked on the wall and the breathing had stopped immediately. I went back to room 9 with a flashlight and checked every corner, every closet, every inch of the floor. I checked whether any of the locked windows could be opened from outside. They couldn't. The latches were original hardware, painted over multiple times, impossible to open without visible damage. Clean, empty, locked. I told Derek the same thing I'd told Gloria. Building sounds. Old construction. He looked at me the way people look when they're too polite to say they think you're wrong. That night I set up my phone on a small stand in the hallway outside room 9. Propped it against the baseboard, camera pointed at the door, started a 12-hour recording. I felt slightly ridiculous doing it. I felt less ridiculous the next morning when I played it back. At 2:47 a.m., the door handle of room 9 moved. Not a rattle, not the building shifting or a draft. A slow, deliberate rotation downward, held for about 3 seconds and then released. The door didn't open. The handle moved and then returned to its resting position. From inside, I called a locksmith and had the lock on room 9 replaced the same day. Deadbolt, the kind that requires a key from both sides. I kept both copies. I didn't tell Gloria or Derek what I'd seen on the footage. I didn't want to alarm them before I understood what was happening. 2 weeks passed. No sounds. No complaints. I started to relax. Then one evening, I was doing a routine check of the building's utility room in the basement when I found something that rearranged my entire understanding of the situation. Behind the water heater pushed against the far wall was a folded blanket, 2 empty water bottles, and a small stack of food wrappers. All recent, the wrappers were from a convenience store 2 blocks away, the kind with a printed date on the receipt that was still tucked inside one of them. The date was from 3 days earlier. I stood in that basement for a long time, trying to work out the layout of the building in my head. The utility room was directly below room 9. There was a maintenance access hatch in the utility room ceiling. I'd never had reason to use it, had honestly half forgotten it existed. I pulled it open and shone my flashlight up. The hatch connected to a crawl space that ran along the underside of the first floor ceiling. And at the far end of that crawl space, directly beneath the floor of room 9, was a second hatch. Unlatched, recently used. Someone had been entering the building through the utility room, accessing the crawl space, and coming up through the floor of room 9 at night. I called the police. They found a man. He was still in the building when the officers arrived. They found him in the crawl space, apparently asleep. He was in his late 40s, disheveled, clearly had been living rough for some time. He was cooperative when they woke him. He didn't resist. He said he'd been using the space for about 6 weeks. 6 weeks? Room 9 had been empty for 8. The officers told me he'd be processed for trespassing, that I should change the utility room lock, that this kind of situation was unfortunately not uncommon in older buildings. They were professional and efficient. I gave a statement and they left. I went back to the building and sat in my office for a while, going over the timeline. 6 weeks of someone in the building. 6 weeks of sounds through the walls. It all fit. It all made sense. Except for one thing. The complaints from Gloria and Derek had started 3 weeks ago. Before that, nothing. If someone had been in that crawl space for 6 weeks, why had the sounds only started 3 weeks in? I pulled up the camera footage from the hallway, all of it, going back to when I'd first set up the phone. I'd only watched the one night when I'd seen the door handle move. I started going through the earlier recordings. On the very first night I'd recorded, the same night I'd spoken to Derek, 5 weeks ago, there was something. At 3:12 a.m., a figure walked down the hallway. Tall, wearing a dark jacket, face turned away from the camera. The figure stopped in front of room 9. Stood there for almost 4 minutes without moving. Then walked back the way it had come and disappeared around the corner toward the stairwell. I checked the stairwell camera for the same timestamp. The stairwell footage showed nothing. No one had come down the stairs or gone up them at that time. The hallway camera had captured someone. The stairwell camera, which covered the only exit from that hallway, had not. The man they'd arrested that morning had been in the crawl space. The figure in the hallway had come from somewhere else. The last transmission came in at 3:58 in the morning. I've listened to it probably 200 times since then, and I still can't explain the last 4 seconds. Amateur radio has been my hobby for about 15 years. I have a decent setup in my garage, HF transceiver, a good antenna, the kind of equipment that lets me pull in signals from well beyond the typical range. Most nights I just scan and listen. Sometimes I talk to people. It's a quiet, meditative thing, and I'm good at it. About 8 months ago, I started picking up something strange on 6.8 megahertz. Not a voice, not a standard transmission, a repeating sequence of tones, evenly spaced, cycling every 40 seconds. The pattern was always the same: 7 tones, a pause, 3 tones, a longer pause, then repeat. No voice component, no identification signal, no content I could decode. This is not as unusual as it sounds. There are plenty of unexplained repeating signals in the amateur radio spectrum, number stations, navigation beacons, signals of unclear origin that have been documented for decades. I logged it, tried to identify it against known signal databases, came up empty, and kept listening. After 2 weeks, the signal changed. The tone sequence shifted. Not randomly, it shortened by 1 tone in the first group. 7 became 6. Then the next night, 6 became 5. It was counting down. I started recording every session. Over the next 9 days, the first group decreased by 1 tone each night: 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. On the 10th night, there was only the 3-tone second group and the pause. On the 11th night, nothing. The frequency was clean for the first time in almost 3 weeks. I assumed the source had simply gone offline. I moved on. 4 nights later, it came back. But this time, it wasn't a tone sequence. It was a voice. A man's voice speaking slowly, with a slight distortion that suggested either distance or poor equipment. He was reading numbers, long strings of them, the kind of thing that number stations broadcast. I recorded it and spent the next several days running the numbers through every decryption method I knew. Nothing resolved into anything coherent. Then, on the 3rd night of voice transmissions, the man stopped reading numbers mid-sequence. There was a pause, and then he said my call sign. Not a call sign like mine. My call sign. The specific identifying sequence assigned to my license, the one I use when I transmit. He said it clearly, waited, and then continued with the numbers as if nothing had happened. I reported it to the FCC. They take unauthorized use of licensed call signs seriously. A case was opened. An investigator contacted me, asked for copies of my recordings, told me they would attempt to triangulate the signal source on the next transmission. The next transmission came 3 nights later. The investigator had equipment running. They got a fix. The source was approximately 4 miles from my house. A rural property, farmland, a decommissioned agricultural building, no registered occupant. Officers were dispatched. The building was empty when they arrived. No transmitting equipment found. No evidence of recent occupation except for one thing, a small generator recently used, still warm. Whoever had been there had left within the past hour. The investigator told me this happened sometimes. Pirate operators were mobile and careful. He said they'd continue monitoring the frequency. He said it in the tone of someone wrapping up a case that wasn't going to be solved. I kept recording every night. 2 weeks later, the voice came back. Same frequency, same slow cadence. But the numbers were different this time, and when I ran them as coordinates, they resolved. They pointed to my address. I called the investigator immediately and told him what I'd found. He said he'd flag it and have a patrol check my property. He said it was likely a coincidence. That was the last time I spoke to him. He stopped returning my calls after that. When I contacted the FCC office directly, they said the case had been closed due to insufficient evidence. The transmissions continued for another 3 weeks. Always the same voice. Always the same slow delivery. I kept recording and I kept trying to decode and I kept coming up empty. On the last night I received a transmission, something was different. The number sequence ran for about 6 minutes as usual. Then the voice stopped. The frequency went silent. Then there were 4 seconds of something that was not numbers and not silence. I've slowed it down, filtered it, run every analysis I know how to run. At normal speed, it sounds like static with a faint tonal undercurrent. Slowed to 25%, it resolves into something that my brain keeps insisting is breathing, slow, steady, very close to the microphone. The last half second, slowed down, sounds like a single whispered word. I've played it for 3 people. All 3 of them heard the same thing I heard. None of us want to say it out loud. The patient in room 412 had been declared dead at 11:42 p.m. By midnight, he was asking for water. I've worked in hospital administration for 9 years. Not clinical, I manage staff scheduling, coordinate between departments, handle the logistical side of keeping a floor running. I'm not a nurse or a doctor. I don't make medical decisions, and I don't form the same kind of attachment to patients that clinical staff do. I say that because what happened on the 4th floor 18 months ago is not a story I should have any emotional stake in. I have an enormous emotional stake in it. The 4th floor of our hospital is a general medical ward, Mr. Aldridge had been a patient there for 11 days following a severe cardiac event. He was 74 years old, had no family that anyone had been able to reach, and had been in serious but stable condition for most of his stay. On the night in question, his condition had declined rapidly over the course of the evening. The clinical team had done everything they could. He was declared deceased at 11:42 p.m. by the attending physician. The standard process began: documentation, notification attempts, the careful procedure that follows a patient's death. At 12:09 a.m., a nurse named Sandra called the floor supervisor. Mr. Aldridge had asked for water. The attending physician was called back immediately. What followed was one of the most extraordinary things any of the clinical staff on that floor had witnessed. A man who had been without a detectable pulse for 27 minutes was sitting partially upright in his bed, awake, oriented, and asking for water in a clear and normal voice. Medicine has documented cases of what's sometimes called the Lazarus phenomenon, spontaneous return of circulation after cardiac arrest. It's rare, it's not fully understood, but it exists. The clinical team treated it accordingly. Mr. Aldridge was re-evaluated, stabilized, and moved to a higher care unit within the hour. As an administrator, I heard about it the next morning the way you hear about extraordinary events in a hospital, through the particular kind of subdued, carefully professional discussion that clinical staff use when something has shaken them. I noted it and moved on. What brought me back to it was a conversation I had with Sandra 2 days later. She had been the nurse who first responded when Mr. Aldridge asked for water. She was calm when she told me what she was about to tell me, the kind of calm that people adopt when they've decided to say something difficult and have accepted that it might not be believed. She said that when she had entered room 412 and found Mr. Aldridge awake, he had not only asked for water. He had also told her something. He had told her that the woman in the chair had said it wasn't time yet. Sandra had looked at the chair in the corner of the room. It was empty. She had asked Mr. Aldridge what woman he meant. He had described her in detail, elderly. White hair, pale blue gown, sitting in the chair watching him. He said she had spoken to him clearly and told him he needed to go back. Sandra knew I had access to patient records across the floor. She asked me whether I could tell her anything about the history of room 412. I looked it up that afternoon. Room 412 had housed over 100 patients in the years our records covered. But going back about 4 years, there was a notation I hadn't seen before, a flag added by a former floor supervisor indicating that room 412 had been the subject of repeated informal staff reports. Sounds, presence. The particular atmosphere that old hospital rooms sometimes develop. The flag referenced a specific patient as the origin point of the reports. A woman who had spent an extended period on the 4th floor several years earlier. No family, no visitors. She had died in room 412 on a quiet night, alone, sitting up in the chair by the window because she had told the staff that lying flat made her feel like she was already gone. I went back to Sandra with the file. I showed her the patient's photograph from the intake records. Sandra looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "That's her. That's the woman he described, Mr. Aldridge recovered. He spent another week in the hospital and was discharged in good condition, which his medical team described as remarkable given the severity of his original event and the 27-minute gap. I visited him once before he left. I told him I'd heard he'd had quite a scare. He smiled and said that was one way to put it. I asked him whether he remembered anything from the time he'd been unresponsive. He said he remembered everything. He said he had been somewhere that he couldn't fully describe, not dark, not painful, just very still. And that there had been a woman there who sat across from him and spoke to him quietly for what felt like a long time. He said she had told him things about the hospital, about the floor, about the room. Things she said she had learned during her own long stay there. He said she had seemed at peace. He said she had not seemed like someone who wanted anything from him, except to make sure he wasn't afraid. I asked him what she had said that made him decide to come back. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said she had told him there was someone in his life who still needed him. Someone he hadn't spoken to in years because of an old argument. She had given him a name. He said the name was his daughter's. He had not told anyone at the hospital that he had a daughter. It had not come up in any intake paperwork, any clinical conversation, any of the family notification attempts. As far as our records were concerned, he had no family. He made a phone call from his hospital room the morning before he was discharged. I don't know what was said on that call. It wasn't my business to know. What I know is that when I walked past room 412 on my way out that evening, Mr. Aldridge was standing at the window with a phone to his ear. And he was crying, but not the way people cry when something is wrong.